is that like you just mentioned that the Putinism is like people get together and fight together, right? And the consumerism is like the work as individual. But like I thought that Putinism is connected with the warrior culture, right? So I think like can I interpret Putinism as another form of perfection of slavery? Because like it's a bigger scale of like slavery, like.
Okay, so that's a great question, okay? So we just said that consumer culture is the perfection of slavery, but is warrior culture slavery? And you can make the argument that it's actually anti-slavery. Why? Why? What can the warrior do that the consumer cannot do? What's the problem with having a warrior culture, really? Excuse me? No, what can warriors do that consumers would never do? Guys, warriors can rebel, right? Warriors can mutiny. The army can be like, you guys are terrible, we're going to rebel against you, okay? You understand? Does that make sense to you? Consumers don't do that. Consumers like, I'm going to rebel. I'm going to stop buying things. No one's going to do that, okay? You'll never be like, I'm going to stop buying things because I think it's bad for the environment. You won't do that. Whereas warriors are like, you know what, I don't like this leader, let's march to Moscow and get rid of him. They can do that, and they do that all the time. That's why warrior culture is so destructive, and that's why warrior culture was so dominant before, and then we got rid of it. Because for political leaders, warrior culture is a direct threat. Does that make sense? Okay, so, but in this question, this reveals a contradiction in Putinism, okay? What is the ultimate problem in Putin turning his entire country into a war society? What's the problem with that? And it's a huge problem for Russia. And this is why ultimately Russia will not triumph in a multipolar world. In fact, it'll probably fall apart. Why? For a warrior culture to triumph, what does it need? Warriors fight best when what? When there's a king, guys. When there's a king. That's why we have kings. Right? So what's the problem with Putin's Russia? What's going to happen to Russia? Guys, eventually Putin's going to die. Do you understand? Eventually he's going to die. And then what's going to happen? The country's going to fall apart because there's a warrior culture. And you have these different generals fighting each other for total control. It's going to be civil war. Okay? Putin right now is a strategic genius. He's the king. Everyone admires him. So he unites everyone, and he can direct all society into total war. When he dies, this society is going to fall apart. Okay? That's why Putin's legacy will not be a strong Russia. It will be Putinism. Okay? The idea of continuous war. Russia may not survive without Putin. Okay? And quite honestly, when you have a great leader like Putin, it's impossible to replace him. Right? No one would have his genius and authority and ruthlessness. Okay? Does that make sense? Right? All right. And David, you had a question?
Yeah. So I was just wondering, like, does the whole Russia agree with this Putinism? Like, is there possibilities that there will be like rebellions in the future?
Okay. So David asked a great question. Okay. How much of society agrees with Putin? And the answer is, like, no one. Most people don't like to go to war. Okay. Most people are scared by war. But ultimately, society is determined by those who are willing to act on their beliefs, okay? So when we looked at America, look, the Israel lobby, they're only a small fraction of the American population, like less than 1%, okay? But because they're willing to act, and they're organized, and they're determined, they get their way. Okay, does that make sense? Same thing in Russia, where at most, okay, I would say at most, you have 10% who are like, oh, Putinism is a great idea. Let's go conquer the world, okay? At most, you have 10%. Most people are like, we want peace. We want to live our lives. I have children. I want my children to be safe. I don't want to send my children to war, okay? But again, history is determined by those who are determined to act in unison. Okay, so it's usually the most extreme individuals who get their way. Does that make sense? Okay, but thanks for the question. Okay, any more questions?
Since all of these three lists is on the left, it's kind of related to war. Does civilization or culture require to have war?
Okay, so Putin believes that Russia is first and foremost a great civilization. Okay, but as a great civilization, it also has to fight wars to protect itself. You understand? So Putin's like, you know what? If America left us alone, we would not fight wars. Okay? It's only because America insists on encircling us, insists on trying to destroy our culture, our civilization, that we must fight a war. Okay? Does that make sense? All right? And so what people say is, listen, the war in Ukraine, it's ultimately caused by NATO encroachment into Russia, right? So NATO, after the Soviet Union fell, expanded 5 times. Guys, NATO was set up as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union. Well, if you don't have a Soviet Union, you don't need NATO anymore. So why is NATO expanding? In fact, NATO was going to expand into Ukraine. So Putin is like, we are fighting this war ultimately to defend our civilization. That's what matters, the defense of our civilization. And if it requires us into going, if it requires us to go to war, then we will do so. Okay? And this is this process that will create Putinism, okay? Or continuous war. Does that make sense? Okay. Any more questions? Yeah?
As mentioned, probably only like 10% of the Russians actually agree with Putinism. Then is there possibilities that the other 90% people need to sacrifice their children to fight in a war for the wills of those 10%?
Okay, so even though only 10% agree with Putinism, I actually don't know the real number, okay? But I think it's only a minority. What happens is that in war, people become much more unified. Okay, so the example is Ukraine, where actually about 50% of the people in Ukraine were Russian speakers. Okay, and there was a large group of people, at least a third, who were sympathetic towards Russia. But the moment that Putin invaded, they all united under Zelensky, okay? So that's what war does. War unifies people. So again, back to the island example, you guys may hate each other when you land on the island, but hey, if there's 1 million flesh-eating monkeys that want to kill you, you guys are going to become a family. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, any more questions? Is this clear to you guys? Okay? You look as though you want to ask a question. Are you confused by something, Celine?
Is that all civilization need war?
Excuse me?
Like, does all civilization need war, like in history? And
Okay, so again, Russia is a warrior culture. It enjoys war, it's good at fighting wars, okay? But China is not a warrior culture. And the reason why is that throughout most of Chinese history, China was the dominant power, the hegemon, okay? Also, China is surrounded by natural defenses, right? So to the east, you have the sea. To the south and to the west, you have mountains. To the north, you have the Great Wall, okay? So China doesn't feel threatened by anyone, and therefore, it doesn't have a warrior culture. Does that make sense? But Russia is a huge country that's been invaded multiple times. And all these invasions were traumatic for Russia. Okay, so you look at the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941, that killed 20 million people. Millions of Russians died in that war. And people still celebrate that war. Okay? So China is not a warrior culture. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay? Any more questions? Okay. So what we will do next week is we'll talk about Putin's strategic genius, okay? And what I will show you, and this will be interesting, is that the way that Russians see the world is radically different from the way we see the world, okay? So we'll discuss Putin's strategy moving forward next class, okay? Does that make sense? All right, good.